The rain lashed against the tinted windows of the black sedan, mirroring the storm of camera flashes waiting outside the Park estate. Park Jin-ho sat in the back seat, his face a mask of sculpted marble. Beside him, Hana sat stiffly, her small hands trembling against the cheap fabric of her maid's uniform. Today, that uniform would be replaced by a designer gown, but to the world, she was still just the help. "Keep your head up," Jin-ho said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "They are looking for a victim. Don't give them one." The headlines had been brutal for weeks. "The fallen dragon," one tabloid screamed, "the eunuch king of Seoul," mocked another. Since the assassination attempt 6 months ago, the rumor that Park Jin-ho had lost his vitality, along with his health, had spread like wildfire. His rivals in the Seok Glow syndicate were already carving up his territory, convinced that a man who couldn't produce an heir was a man who had already lost his crown. Jin-ho knew they were laughing. He knew his stepbrother, Dong-wook, was probably popping champagne at this very moment, celebrating the fact that Jin-ho was marrying down to a lowly maid because no noble family would waste a daughter on an impotent man. As the car pulled up to the curb, the media swarm descended. Microphones were thrust toward the windows. "Mr. Park, is it true the marriage is a cover for your medical condition?" "Hana, how much were you paid to play the role of the sacrificial bride?" Hana flinched, but Jin-ho's hand suddenly clamped over hers. His grip wasn't weak or frail, it was like iron. For a split second, he looked at her. Not as a master looks at a servant, but as a predator looks at his only ally. "Let them laugh, Hana," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a dark, dangerous light. "The loudest people in the room are usually the first ones to bleed when the lights go out." They stepped out into the chaos. The flashbulbs were blinding, a rhythmic pulsing of white light that turned the gray afternoon into a fever dream. Jin-ho didn't limp. He walked with a predatory grace, his long coat billowing behind him. He held Hana's hand firmly, pulling her through the sea of vultures. In the VIP lounge of the wedding hall, Dong-wook was waiting, a smug grin plastered on his face. He leaned against the mahogany bar, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "Big brother," Dong-wook drawled, his eyes raking over Hana with visible disgust. "I have to hand it to you. Most men in your delicate position would just retire to a monastery. But to marry the girl who scrubs your toilets? It's a bold move. It really screams desperation." The room went silent. The bodyguards shifted uncomfortably. Jin-ho stopped 3 inches from his brother's face. He didn't raise his voice, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I chose Hana because she knows how to clean up a mess," Jin-ho said, his voice smooth as silk. "And God knows, this family has a lot of filth that needs to be scrubbed away." He leaned in closer, whispering so only Dong-wook could hear. "Enjoy the wedding, little brother. It's the last party you'll ever attend where you're still invited to the table." Jin-ho turned away, leading Hana toward the altar. The whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. The impotent king was walking toward his throne, and though the crown looked like it was slipping, his stride was that of a man who had already decided where the bodies would be buried. Hana looked up at his profile, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was supposed to be his shield, his cover, his fake wife, but as they stood before the officiant, she realized the world had made a fatal mistake. They thought Jin-ho was a broken man looking for a hiding spot. They didn't realize he was a hunter who had just found the perfect bait. The heavy mahogany door to Park Jin-ho's private study swung shut with a finality that made Hana's heart skip a beat. She stood near the entrance, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her white apron. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and old books, a scent that usually terrified her, but today, it felt even more suffocating. Jin-ho sat behind his massive desk, silhouetted against the gray light of the Seoul skyline. He didn't look like a man suffering from a shameful medical condition. He looked like a king deciding who to execute next. "You've been with this household for 3 years, Hana," Jin-ho said, his eyes fixed on a leather-bound folder in front of him. He didn't look up, but she could feel his focus on her. You're quiet. You don't gossip with the other staff. And most importantly, you have no family left who would care if you disappeared, except for your mother. Hana swallowed hard, the mention of her mother making her throat tighten. She's not doing well, sir. The hospital says the wait list for the surgery is too long and the costs are astronomical. Jin-ho interrupted, finally raising his gaze. His eyes were cold, calculating, and piercingly intelligent. He slid the leather folder across the desk toward her. Inside is a contract. Read it carefully. But I will give you the short version. I need a wife. Not a partner, not a lover, but a ghost who wears a wedding ring. Hana reached out, her hand trembling as she opened the folder. The legal jargon was dense, but the numbers at the bottom made her gasp. It was more money than she would earn in 10 lifetimes. The world thinks I am broken, Jin-ho continued, standing up and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window. He kept his back to her, his shoulders broad and steady. My family is waiting for me to fail so they can strip me of my title. If I marry a woman of status, her family will pry into my life. They will want heirs. They will want medical records. But if I marry you, no one will ask questions. They will simply assume I chose a maid because I am too humiliated to face an equal. Hana looked from the paper to the man. You want me to be your shield. I want you to be a statue. Jin-ho corrected, turning around. The intensity in his expression was enough to make her want to look away, but she held his gaze. You will move into the master suite. You will attend every public event by my side. You will smile when the cameras flash and stay silent when the reporters scream. In exchange, your mother will be moved to the best private clinic in the country by tomorrow morning. Her surgery will be performed by the top surgeon in Asia. Every cent of her recovery will be covered. And after? Hana whispered. What happens when you don't need me anymore? Jin-ho stepped closer, entering her personal space. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head back to see him. He reached out, his thumb brushing against the side of her jaw, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle yet felt like a warning. If you follow my rules, you will be set for life, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. But if you betray me, if you whisper a single word of our arrangement to anyone, you will lose everything, including your mother's care. Hana thought of her mother's pale face in the hospital bed and the debt collectors who banged on her door every week. She thought of the way the other maids looked at her, like she was invisible. Then she looked at Jin-ho. He was a dangerous man, a mob boss with more enemies than friends, but he was offering her a miracle wrapped in a lie. I'll do it, she said, her voice gaining a sudden, unexpected strength. Jin-ho's lips didn't curve into a smile, but his eyes darkened with something that looked like approval. He handed her a sleek gold fountain pen. Sign it, Hana. From this moment on, you aren't a maid. You are the future Mrs. Park. Make sure you play the part well. As she pressed the pen to the paper, Hana felt like she was signing a pact with the devil. She didn't know then that the impotent man standing before her was hiding a fire that would eventually burn down everything she knew. The engagement party was held in the grand ballroom of the Park estate, a room filled with crystal chandeliers that cast sharp, cold light over the elite of Seoul's underworld. Hana felt like a lamb in a den of wolves. Her designer dress was a shimmering silver, but beneath the silk, her skin crawled. She was surrounded by women in diamonds who looked at her as if she were a stain on the carpet, and men who whispered behind their hands about the tragedy of Park Jin-ho's manhood. Jin-ho stood beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. To the crowd, he looked like a proud groom, but Hana could feel the tension in his muscles. He wasn't celebrating, he was standing guard. Look at her! A loud, mocking voice rang out, cutting through the classical music. Dong-wook, Jin-ho's stepbrother, swaggered toward them. He was already flushed from expensive cognac, his tie loosened and a cruel smirk plastered on his face. A small circle of cousins and business associates followed him, sensing a kill. "I've seen some desperate power moves in this family, but this takes the cake," Dong-wook said, stopping just inches from Hana. He leaned in, sniffing the air near her shoulder. "She still smells like lemon polish and floor wax. Tell me, Jin-ho, did you pick her because she's the only one who doesn't mind a husband who's just decorative?" The surrounding guests stifled laughs. Hana's face burned with shame. She looked down at her shoes, feeling the familiar weight of her old life as a servant trying to drag her under. She felt like an imposter, a fake queen in a palace of real monsters. "Dong-wook," Jin-ho said quietly. The room didn't go silent because he yelled. It went silent because the tone of his voice was like a razor blade hidden in velvet. "You've had too much to drink. Leave." "Oh, come on. We're all family here." Dong-wook laughed, turning to the crowd. "We all know why he's marrying the maid. A real woman from a real family would expect a wedding night. But Hana, she's used to taking orders. She won't complain when her husband spends the night staring at the ceiling because he's got nothing left in the tank." Dong-wook reached out, his hand moving to flick Hana's chin in a demeaning gesture. Before his fingers could touch her skin, Jin-ho moved. It was too fast for the human eye to follow. One moment Jin-ho was standing still, and the next, he had Dong-wook's wrist in a grip that made the bone creak audibly. Dong-wook let out a sharp yelp of pain, his cognac glass shattering on the marble floor. Jin-ho didn't let go. He stepped into his brother's space, his face inches away, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. The weakness the media had written about was nowhere to be found. In its place was a predatory stillness that made the air in the room feel heavy. "You are breathing because I allow it," Jin-ho whispered, though his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "You are standing in my house because I haven't decided to throw you out yet. But if you ever speak to my wife again, if you even look in her direction with that pathetic, drunken gaze, I will make sure you never speak or look at anything ever again. Do you understand?" Dong-wook's face turned from red to a sickly, pale white. He tried to pull away, but Jin-ho's grip was a vice. It was a joke, Jin-ho. Just a joke." "I don't have a sense of humor," Jin-ho replied. He released his brother's arm with a flick of his wrist, sending Dong-wook stumbling back into a table of hors d'oeuvres. Jin-ho turned back to Hana. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch cold but steady. He looked out at the assembled guests, his gaze a challenge to anyone else who dared to breathe a word of dissent. "The party is over," Jin-ho announced. "Get out, all of you." As the guests scrambled to leave, terrified by the sudden glimpse of the monster beneath the suit, Hana realized that her impotent husband was the most dangerous man she had ever met. And for the first time, she wasn't just afraid of him, she was grateful for him. The honeymoon phase of their fake marriage was less about romance, and more about surviving the heavy silence of the Park mansion. Now that she was the mistress of the house, Hana no longer scrubbed the floors, but she still walked the hallways with the quiet footsteps of a ghost. Jin-ho was rarely home, spending his nights in high-stakes meetings or locked in his study, leaving Hana to navigate the cold luxury of her new life alone. One Tuesday afternoon, while the house staff was busy in the lower wing, Hana found herself outside Jin-ho's private library. The door was slightly ajar, a rare oversight for a man as meticulous as her husband. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a strange, growing concern for the man who had saved her mother, she stepped inside. The room smelled of old paper and the bitter scent of the herbal tea Jin-ho drank every night. As she moved toward the desk to close the window against a rising breeze, her toe caught the edge of a floor safe that hadn't been fully recessed into the wood. Next to it, lay a thick manila folder embossed with the seal of a prestigious private hospital. Hana's heart hammered. She knew she shouldn't look. But the rumors of Jin-ho's condition haunted her. She wanted to know the truth about the man she was protecting. She opened the file, her eyes scanning the medical jargon. There were blood reports, hormone levels, and a series of prescriptions for powerful medications. To her untrained eyes, the numbers looked devastatingly low. One page, signed by a Dr. Kang, explicitly detailed the permanent nerve damage from the assassination attempt. "Oh, Jin-ho," she whispered, with her chest tightening with genuine pity. She felt a rush of guilt for every time she had felt afraid of him. To her, this file explained his coldness, his late nights, and his terrifying temper. He wasn't just a mob boss. He was a man mourning his own body, hiding his shame from a world that would devour him if they knew he was truly broken. Determined to be more than just a contract bride, Hana began to change. She spent her afternoons researching holistic health and nerve recovery. She started visiting the local apothecary, buying expensive ginseng and rare herbs. Every night, she would personally brew his tea, stirring in the supplements she believed would help him heal. When Jin-ho returned home late that evening, he found Hana waiting in the dim light of the kitchen. She looked small, but determined, pushing a steaming cup toward him. "What is this?" he asked, his voice weary as he loosened his silk tie. "It's for your health," Hana said, her voice soft with a new kind of tenderness. I know you're going through a lot. You don't have to carry the burden alone, even if it's just between us." Jin-ho stared at the tea, then up at her. His eyes searched hers, looking for a hidden motive or a sign of betrayal. He saw nothing but sincere, heartbreaking empathy. He didn't know she had seen the file, a file he had carefully forged and left out specifically to test her loyalty and see if she would leak the proof to his enemies. He took a slow sip of the bitter liquid, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw the way her hands hovered nearby, ready to catch him if he stumbled. For the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't cold calculation crossed his face. He was faking a tragedy to trap his brothers, but he hadn't expected to trap the heart of the woman sitting across from him. "You're a strange girl, Hana," he murmured, setting the cup down. "I just want you to be whole again," she replied earnestly. Jin-ho looked away, his jaw tightening. He was a predator using her as a shield, but as she reached out to place a comforting hand on his arm, he realized that the more she tried to fix him, the harder it would be to let her go when the blood started to flow. The morning of the wedding did not feel like a celebration. It felt like the mobilization of an army. The air in the mansion was heavy with the scent of lilies and gun oil. As Hana stood before the tall mirror in her bridal suite, and the white silk of her gown felt like a shroud. She looked beautiful, but her eyes were wide with a fear she couldn't hide. Outside the door, she could hear the rhythmic click of safeties being checked and the low, hushed tones of Jin-ho's most trusted lieutenants. This wasn't a union of love. It was a tactical maneuver. When she finally walked down the aisle of the private chapel, the silence was suffocating. The pews were filled with men in charcoal suits, their jackets bulging slightly at the hip or under the arm. These were the heads of the 5 families, the high-ranking soldiers, and the bitter rivals who had come to witness the impotent king surrender his pride. Every guest was an enemy, and every guest was armed. Jin-ho stood at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in a black tuxedo. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as straight as a spear. As Hana reached him, he took her hand. His skin was cool, his grip steady, but his eyes were scanning the room, counting the exits and watching the hands of every man in the front row. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the low drone of the organ. "No matter what happens, do not let go of my hand." The ceremony began, but no one was listening to the priest's words about holy matrimony, or to have and to hold. The guests were too busy watching for a sign of weakness. Hana could feel the weight of 100 stares, most of them landing on Jin-ho with a mixture of pity and predatory hunger. They were waiting for him to flinch, for his hand to shake, for some proof that the man who had once ruled Seoul with an iron fist was truly gone. Beside them, Dong-wook sat in the front row, his bruised wrist hidden under his sleeve, a dark, hateful smirk on his face. He leaned over to whisper something to a rival boss, and the two men chuckled quietly. The disrespect was palpable, a thick layer of tension that made it hard for Hana to breathe. As they reached the part of the ceremony for the rings, a sudden, loud, metallic clang echoed through the stone chapel. In an instant, half the room was on their feet, hands disappearing into their jackets. The air turned electric, the sound of chairs scraping against stone sounding like a volley of shots. Hana gasped, her heart leaping into her throat, but Jin-ho didn't move. He didn't even blink. And it was just a server in the back who had dropped a silver tray, but the reaction told the whole story. This wasn't a wedding. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Jin-ho looked at the standing men, his expression one of bored contempt. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a shout, but the authority in his voice was so absolute that the men slowly lowered themselves back into their seats, looking embarrassed, yet even more agitated. He turned back to Hana and slid the gold band onto her finger. For a moment his gaze softened as he looked at her. He knew she was terrified. He knew she had spent weeks trying to heal him with tea and kindness, unaware that she was standing in the middle of a battlefield. "I, Park Jin-ho, take you to be my wife," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong, defying the rumors of his frailty. Hana recited her vows with a trembling voice, her eyes locked on his. In that moment, surrounded by assassins and monsters, he was the only thing that felt solid. She slipped the ring onto his finger, her touch lingering. The ceremony ended not with a kiss of passion, but with a silent pact. As they turned to face the crowd of armed well-wishers, Hana realized the honeymoon wouldn't be spent in paradise. It would be spent in a war zone. The heavy double doors of the master suite clicked shut, locking out the muffled sounds of the distant reception. The room was bathed in the soft amber glow of dim lamps, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the faint metallic scent of the city rain. Hana stood by the edge of the silk-covered bed, her fingers fumbling with the intricate lace of her wedding gown. She felt a wave of exhaustion hit her, mixed with a deep, aching pity for the man standing by the window. In her mind, this was to be a night of quiet sadness. She expected Jin-ho to retreat into his usual cold silence, perhaps even sleeping in the guest wing to hide the shame of his condition. She had already prepared a thermos of her special herbal tea, hoping the warmth would soothe the invisible wounds she thought he carried. "You don't have to stay here, Jin-ho," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I understand. I've prepared the tea, and I'll tell the staff tomorrow that everything was as it should be. Your secret is safe with me." Jin-ho didn't move. He stood with his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the glass. "My secret," he repeated, his voice devoid of the weariness he had shown all day. It sounded deeper, vibrating with a hidden power that made the hair on Hana's arms stand up. Slowly, he turned around. He began to unbutton his tuxedo jacket, tossing it onto a chair with a fluid, athletic grace that didn't belong to a broken man. He pulled at his tie, discarding it as he stepped into the light. The limp he had displayed during the ceremony was gone. His movements were predatory, certain, and dangerously fast. Hana backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jin-ho? What are you doing?" He didn't answer until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out, and instead of the hesitant touch of a sick man, his hand was firm as he gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him. The heat radiating from his body was intense, a living fire that contradicted every medical report she had read. "The file you found in my study," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "The one from Dr. Kang? I wrote it myself. I leaked it to the board of directors and my stepbrother 6 months ago. I needed them to think I was a lion without teeth, so they would stop hiding and start showing their hand. Hana's breath hitched. But the tea? The medicines? I saw you taking them. Jin-ho reached for the thermos she had brought. He unscrewed the cap and poured a bit of the liquid into a glass, but he didn't drink it. Instead, he pulled a small chemical strip from his pocket and dipped it in. And within seconds, the paper turned a violent, bruised purple. "This is why I chose you, Hana," he said, his eyes turning into shards of ice. "Because you are the only person in this house who isn't trying to kill me. Someone has been spiking my herbal supplements with a slow-acting neurotoxin for months. They wanted to turn the lie into a reality. They wanted to make sure I really did become the impotent, withered man they mocked at the altar." Hana stared at the purple strip, yet the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Her attempts to heal him had been a vehicle for his murder. "Who?" she gasped. "Who would do this?" "The same person who invited the assassins tonight," Jin-ho said. He reached behind his back, pulling a sleek silver handgun from his waistband and laying it on the nightstand with a heavy thud. "And they're coming for us now. They think I'm a helpless victim in a silk bed." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a way that was anything but decorative. It was a kiss of fire and iron, a claim that shattered the contract they had signed. When he pulled back, his eyes were glowing with a terrifying, vengeful light. "The show is over, Hana. Tonight, the impotent king wakes up, and I'm going to make sure they regret every joke they ever made at our expense." The air in the master suite felt electric, heavy with the revelation that Jin-ho's weakness had been a masterful lie. But, as the distant sound of a window shattering echoed from the floor below, the reality of their danger crashed back in. Jin-ho didn't panic. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier, checking the magazine of his handgun before sliding a secondary blade into his sleeve. "Stay behind the reinforced wall," Jin-ho commanded, pointing toward a hidden alcove behind the heavy velvet curtains. "Don't come out until I give the word." Hana scrambled toward the shadows, her mind racing. She reached for her silk clutch, intending to grab her phone to call for help, but as she opened it, a small burner device she didn't recognize tumbled out onto the carpet. It buzzed once, a short, sharp vibration that felt like a sting. Heart pounding, she picked it up. A single message glowed on the screen. "Room 4. O2 is clear. He's drugged. Do it now." The blood drained from Hana's face. That phone hadn't been there an hour ago. The only person who had been alone with her bag during the reception was Mina, her childhood friend, and the only other maid she had trusted to help her get ready for the ceremony. Mina was the one who had encouraged her to marry Jin-ho, the one who had helped her brew the healing teas every night. "Jin-ho, wait," Hana whispered, her voice cracking. Before he could respond, the bedroom door was kicked open. 2 men in tactical gear burst in, silenced submachine guns raised. Jin-ho dropped to one knee, his own weapon barking twice. The intruders fell before they could pull their triggers, their bodies hitting the rug with heavy thuds. In the sudden ringing silence that followed, a third figure stepped into the doorway. It wasn't an assassin in a mask. It was Mina. She was holding a small silver pistol, her eyes wide and wet with tears, but her aim was steady. "Mina." Hana stepped out from the shadows, her voice trembling with disbelief. "What are you doing? Why are you here?" "I'm sorry, Hana," Mina sobbed, though she didn't lower the gun. "They told me they would help your mother. They said Jin-ho was a monster who was just using you as a meat shield. Dong-wook promised me that if I helped them get rid of him tonight, we could both be free. He said he'd pay for everything." Hana felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest. Every kind word Mina had said, every late-night conversation about fixing Jin-ho's health, had been a setup. Mina hadn't been helping her save a man. She had been helping Dong-wook poison one. "He lied to you, Mina," Jin-ho said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he stood up, his gun still pointed toward the floor but ready to rise in a heartbeat. Dongwook doesn't pay his debts. He buries them. Do you really think he'd let a witness like you live once the impotent king was dead? Mina's hand shook violently. He said it was for the best. He said Hana deserved better than a broken man. I am the one who decides what I deserve, Hana shouted, stepping in front of Jin-ho. She looked at her oldest friend and saw a stranger fueled by greed and manipulated by a snake. You sold me out, Mina. You sold out my mother. You put the poison in the tea I gave him with my own hands. Mina looked at the bodies on the floor, then back at the cold, lethal man standing behind Hana. She realized then that the rumors were wrong. Jin-ho wasn't the victim. He was the executioner. With a choked cry, she turned and bolted down the hallway, her footsteps disappearing into the chaos of the mansion. Hana collapsed against the wall, her wedding dress stained with the soot and blood of a night that had turned into a nightmare. She had lost her only friend, and the person she thought she was protecting was the most dangerous predator in the room. Jin-ho walked over to her, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer a hug, but he placed a firm, grounding hand on her shoulder. Now you know the cost of loyalty in this world, Hana, he said quietly. It's a lesson most people don't survive. But you're still standing. The smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne hung thick in the air as the mansion's security system wailed, a high-pitched scream that signaled the perimeter had been completely lost. Jin-ho moved through the darkened hallway with the fluid, silent grace of a ghost. His hand locked firmly around Hana's wrist. He wasn't dragging her. He was shielding her, his body a living barrier between her and the shadows. Stay low and breathe, he whispered, his voice steady even as the sound of boots thudded on the marble stairs below. My men are holding the south wing, but the traitors are already inside the residential quarters. Hana nodded, her lungs burning. The silver silk of her wedding dress was torn at the hem, and she had long since kicked off her heels to keep up with him. She wasn't a soldier, and she wasn't a Mafia princess, but the betrayal she had just witnessed from Mina had sparked something fierce in her chest. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a woman who had seen the monster beneath the suit and decided she would rather stand with him than die with the wolves. As they reached the gallery overlooking the grand foyer, the darkness was suddenly shattered by the red beams of laser sights. Down! Jin-ho barked, shoving Hana behind a heavy marble pedestal. A hail of bullets shredded the priceless paintings on the wall above them, sending canvas and plaster flying like confetti. Jin-ho leaned out, his handgun barking in rhythmic, lethal succession. He didn't fire wildly. Every shot was a calculated move, a statement of absolute control. He was a symphony of violence, proving with every heartbeat that the impotent rumors had been the greatest trap ever set. But even a king can be flanked. From a hidden service door behind the pedestal, a shadowed figure emerged, one of Dongwook's elite enforcers who had bypassed the main stairs. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the center of Jin-ho's back, while the boss was focused on the shooters in the foyer. Hana saw the glint of the barrel before Jin-ho did. There was no time to scream, no time to warn him. Her body moved on an instinct she didn't know she possessed. She didn't think about the contract, her mother's medical bills, or the lie they were living. She only thought of the man who had looked at her with approval when the rest of the world looked at her with disgust. She lunged forward, throwing herself into the path of the assassin's line of fire. The crack of the pistol felt like it happened inside her own skull. A searing, white-hot iron rod seemed to pass through her shoulder, spinning her around. The force of the impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and she collapsed against Jin-ho's legs, the world turning into a blurred haze of gray and red. Jin-ho spun around, his eyes widening in a rare moment of genuine shock. In a blur of motion, he grabbed the assassin's throat with one hand, the sound of breaking bone echoing through the gallery, and fired a single, finishing shot without even looking. He dropped to his knees beside Hana, his hands, usually so steady, trembling as he pulled her into his lap. He pressed his palm against the wound in her shoulder, his tuxedo shirt quickly soaking through with her blood. "Why?" he hissed, his voice raw with a mix of fury and something that sounded dangerously like pain. "You were supposed to stay behind the stone. You're a civilian, Hana. You don't take bullets for people like me." Hana looked up at him, a weak, trembling smile touching her lips despite the agony. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold numbness, but she reached up with her good hand and touched his cheek. You saved my mother," she whispered, her voice fading. "I told you. I wanted you to be whole. I'm not a statue, Jinho. I'm your wife." Jinho stared at her, the mask of the cold Mafia boss finally cracking. He didn't see a maid or a tool or a shield. He saw the only person in his entire life who had ever offered him something for free. He scooped her up in his arms, standing tall as his reinforcements finally swarmed the hallway, their black tactical gear gleaming in the emergency lights. "Get the medic!" Jinho roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the house. "If she dies, I will burn this entire city to the ground, starting with every man in this room." The silver silk of Hana's wedding dress was rapidly turning a deep, wet crimson as Jinho carried her through the smoke-filled corridor. He didn't look like a man in retreat. He looked like a god of war descending into the underworld. He handed her off to his personal medic behind the reinforced steel doors of the safe room, his eyes lingering on her pale face for only a heartbeat before the steel slammed shut. When he turned back to the hallway, the last shred of his humanity had vanished. "Seal the exits," Jinho said into his radio, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "No one leaves this house. Not the shooters, not the traitors, and especially not my brother." The mansion, once a place of quiet luxury, transformed into a slaughterhouse. Dongwook's men, hearing the rumors of Jinho's frailty, had expected to find a dying man hiding under a bed. Instead, they found a nightmare. Jinho moved through the house with a brutal mathematical precision. He didn't use a silencer anymore. He wanted them to hear him coming. The rhythmic crack-crack of his handgun echoed through the halls, followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the marble. In the grand foyer, Dongwook was screaming at his remaining mercenaries, his face twisted in a mask of panicked greed. "He's just one man. He's supposed to be sick. Find him and finish it." "Looking for me?" The voice came from the darkness of the second-floor balcony. Jinho stepped into the light of the flickering chandelier, his white dress shirt splattered with the blood of the men he had already cut down. He tossed an empty magazine aside and slammed a fresh one home with a metallic snap that sounded like a death knell. Dongwook's breath hitched. You were faking it. The doctors, the reports. You played us all. I needed to see who would sharpen their knives the moment I closed my eyes." Jinho said, leaping over the railing and landing with the silent grace of a predator. He didn't stop moving. He walked through a hail of bullets as if they were nothing more than rain, his own weapon barking in response. Every shot he fired found a throat or a heart. He wasn't just defending his life, he was purging his empire. The mercenaries scattered, their courage failing as they realized they were fighting a ghost who had come back to life. Jinho didn't let them run. He moved through the foyer like a whirlwind of silver and lead. He used a discarded combat knife to open the throat of a shooter who got too close, his movements so fast they were a blur of red. He was no longer the impotent king. He was the absolute ruler of Seoul, and he was reclaiming his throne in blood. Finally, only Dongwook remained, backed against the shattered remains of the wedding cake. He held a trembling pistol, but Jinho was on him before he could even aim. Jinho grabbed the barrel of the gun, twisting it until Dongwook's wrist snapped with a sickening pop. He threw his stepbrother to the floor, pinning him down with a polished leather boot pressed against his throat. "Please, Jinho, we're blood." Dongwook gasped, clawing at the boot. "The only blood I care about is the blood you spilled from my wife," Jinho replied, his voice devoid of any mercy. He leaned down, his eyes dark with a cold, flickering fire. You thought I was weak. You thought I was broken. But I have never been more powerful than I am tonight. He didn't pull the trigger. Death was too easy for a traitor. Instead, Jin Ho's men moved in from the shadows, dragging Dong Wook away to a basement where the sun never rose. Jin Ho stood alone in the center of the wreckage, the silence of the mansion returning, heavy and thick. He took a deep, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. He didn't look at the bodies or the ruined wealth around him. He turned and walked back toward the safe room, his heart hammering for the only thing that mattered. The world now knew the truth. The dragon was awake, Nguyen, and he had a queen to protect. The morning sun broke over the Seoul skyline, casting a pale, clean light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite. The chaos of the night before had been scrubbed away by a silent army of loyal cleaners, leaving the mansion smelling of fresh rain and expensive wax once more. In the center of the room, Hana sat propped up against a mountain of silk pillows, her shoulder heavily bandaged, but her face regaining its natural glow. Jin Ho stood by the window, silhouetted against the dawn. He had showered and changed into a simple black sweater, his movements no longer guarded or theatrical. He looked like a man who had finally put down a weight he had been carrying for years. In his hand, he held a single piece of paper, the legal contract they had signed in his study just weeks ago. He walked toward the bed, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He didn't say a word as he sat on the edge of the mattress, his gaze fixed on the document. With a slow, deliberate motion, he gripped the edges of the paper and tore it down the middle. Then he tore it again, and again, until the marriage agreement was nothing more than a handful of white confetti on the rug. "The contract is void," Jin Ho said, his voice low and raspy. "Your mother's medical bills are paid in full. There is a trust fund in your name that will ensure you never have to work a day in your life. You are free, Hana. You can walk out of those gates and never look back at this house of ghosts." Hana looked at the shredded paper and then up at the man who had spent his life building walls of ice around his heart. She saw the flickers of uncertainty in his eyes, a vulnerability that was far more real than the impotence he had faked for his enemies. "Is that what you want?" she asked softly. "For me to leave?" Jin Ho looked away, his jaw tightening. "I am a dangerous man, Hana. Last night proved that. I am a target, and anyone standing next to me becomes a target too. You've already bled for a lie. I won't ask you to bleed for the truth." "But I didn't bleed for the contract," Hana replied, reaching out with her good hand to cover his. Her skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold gold ring still on his finger. "I didn't jump in front of that bullet because of a bank account or a signature. I did it because when the world called you weak, I saw your strength. And when the world called you a monster, I saw a man who was just lonely." Jin Ho finally turned his head to look at her. The silence between them wasn't the suffocating quiet of the wedding day. It was the stillness of two people finally seeing each other without the masks. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "I've spent my life buying people," he whispered. "I don't know how to ask for something I haven't paid for." "Then don't ask as a boss," Hana said, a small, genuine smile lighting up her face. "Ask as my husband." Jin Ho leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. He took a deep breath, the scent of her lavender soap grounding him in a way the power of his empire never could. "Stay with me, Hana. Not because you have to, not because of a deal. Stay because I don't want to rule this city if you aren't sitting beside me." He kissed her then. Not the fierce, claiming kiss of the wedding night, but something slow, sweet, and filled with a promise of a future that didn't involve shadows or lies. For the first time in his life, the King of Seoul wasn't fighting a war. He was home. "I'm not going anywhere," Hana whispered against his lips. Outside, the city began to wake up, unaware that the most powerful couple in Korea had just started their real marriage in the quiet of a sunrise. The dragon had found his heart, and the maid had found her kingdom.